This is my daughter's first bike, her first real bike at least. She had trikes and a balance bike before, but this was the first one we got her in order to get her into the world of pedals and just kind of a normal bike. Now, a question you could ask is it better to get them to start braking first or to start pedaling first? But actually, that's not actually the most fundamental question. If you were to ask Kaylee that question as she was on this bike, do you start pedaling first or braking first? I would tell you that's entirely the wrong question, because the problem with this bike, she wouldn't even get on it. If you can't actually get her on the bike, it's useless to ask the question of pedaling or braking. And I will admit to you now that I kind of asked you a question that was like that at the end of last week's video. I asked the question, is it better if you had an hour to do Christian things, is it better to feed the poor or spend time of silence in Jesus? And I hope you all recognize that that was kind of a trick question. Sorry about that. Because what Galatians is teaching us is that our faith isn't about what action should we do, what's the better thing to do we do this or to do that? If there was any right answer to that question, the right answer is whichever one that you freely choose that draws you closer to Jesus. So if you did answer that question, if you thought the right answer was this or that, I ask you, well, why did you choose that? Did you choose that because that's what you should do as a Christian? Did you choose that because that's what a good Christian does? Because we often get into that kind of thinking, right? I think we all recognize that. We say to ourselves, well, a child of God does this. And if we don't see this, whatever this is in our life, then we must not be a very good child of God. But chapter 4, verse 3 says that we were enslaved by that very kind of thinking before Jesus. So with us, while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law. Paul is saying that kind of thinking is all in the past. We no longer have to think about what is the right thing to do in order to be a good Christian. He continues by saying, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child. And if a child, then also an heir through God. We already are children of God. We don't need to earn that. And so the thinking of what to do I do this or do that, has nothing to do with whether or not we are a child of God. We are already an heir. And what are we an heir of? What are we receiving? Well, Paul continues in chapter 4 through an allegory of Isaac and Ishmael. He says in verse 28, now you, my friends, are children of the promise, like Isaac. And what is the promise? Well, go back to chapter 3, verse 9. For this reason, those who believe are blessed with Abraham who believed. And what is that blessing that Abraham received? Well, go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, where God says that through Abraham, all the Gentiles will be blessed. And then Paul picks that up in chapter 3, verse 14, in order that Christ Jesus, the blessing of Abraham, might come to the Gentiles so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So a better question that we could ask ourselves, rather than, well, do we do this or do that with our time? The better question I ask is the same kind of question Paul asked in chapter 3, verse 2. He asks, did you receive the Spirit by doing works of the law or by believing what you heard? And so I'm going to ask you a similar but different question. Have you received the Spirit? You see, in response to Kaylee not riding this bike, we recently got her this bike. And we just broke it out yesterday, and she loved it. She was so excited about getting this new bike that she received, and she got on it, and yet she was a little bit afraid of it. But when she, through my help, got herself comfortable in it, she was racing along the sidewalk here, just having a great time, so excited. Look at me, Daddy, look at me, Daddy. Have you ever received that feeling from Jesus, from the Spirit? Do you remember that first time or the most recent time that you remembered that I am already a child of God? And even Paul is recognizing this. He's saying to the Galatians, don't go back. Don't go back to this thinking that you are a slave to the this or that. Embrace the fact that Jesus has set you free. Simply get on that bike of faith and ride and enjoy it. Remembering that you don't have to do anything in order to enjoy the freedom and the wonderfulness that is life in the Spirit. Now, you still might be concerned and wondering, well, why is it that my life doesn't look very Christian right now? But what does Paul say in Galatians 4, verse 19? He says, "My little children, for whom I am again in the pain of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you." Paul is recognizing that this is a process. And it's not something we do on our own power. We just simply trust the Spirit, and then over time, we become more like Jesus. It's as silly as me asking, well, why isn't Kaylee with this bike, this brand new bike? Why isn't she riding in the Tour de France now? Why isn't she in some bike race right now? That's a silly question because there's still work to be done. But the difference between the bike and the Spirit is that Kaylee might have to, by her own power, get her to bike better. The difference in the good news of Jesus is that we don't need to pedal faster in order to win the prize. You already have everything you need, which is the Spirit of God, the thing that was promised right from the beginning, in order to have a fullness of life with Him. So again, I return to the question, what is the best thing? Do you do this or that? Whatever is going to bring you into deeper submission to God. I hope that through your discussions and through your reflections on that Jesus would come to reveal that to you. But until that, we will actually talk about that even more in our next chapter, chapter 5. So we'll see you again next week.